This is our webinar for purchasers of steel castings, and one of the questions that certainly steel foundries feel needs clarification are some of the challenges in moving patterns. At one level, moving patterns is just changing us from one supplier to another supplier. But as anyone who's actually done this knows, it's far more complicated to move a pattern than just to transfer the pattern to a different manufacturer and begin production. So I'm going to give you a little background, and then we can talk about some of the challenges of moving patterns. When you purchase a casting, before the foundry can make that casting and fulfill your purchase order requirements, the foundry needs to know what steel alloy you want it out of, including the chemistries, mechanical properties, and other evaluations you need for the material that's going to be part of the casting. But then for the casting itself, the geometry, you need both the pattern or drawing of the required parts. You've got to know what the shape is, what you're trying to do. One way of doing that, of course, is to provide a pattern if it already exists. The other is a drawing or a solid model. And then, of course, the non-destructive testing. What level of quality do you want? What level of inspection do you want to verify that the casting will meet all of your requirements? When a new part is created, then the purchaser, the designer, the one who wants to purchase the casting, will contact the supplier to develop that casting under contract. And typically, the pattern is purchased by the supplier, the foundry, but it's purchased for the purchaser, the designer, the one who actually has the design. And so patterns are normally built for a particular supplier under a purchase agreement from the purchaser. And because of that, the purchaser, the designer of the part, owns that physical pattern and all the core boxes that were made for the supplier. So while the supplier is the one who may design the pattern equipment and work with the pattern shop to make it, the actual pattern itself and the core boxes ordinarily belong to the purchaser. It's not always true. You can have a different commercial arrangement. That's a commercial or business practice decision. But the custom and practice in the industry is for the purchaser to own the physical pattern and core boxes. And of course, ordinarily, the purchaser then would have a non-disclosure agreement with the supplier because the purchaser owns the design and all the proprietary information of the part that the pattern is there to produce. And so the purchaser owns the design and the proprietary information of that part. And so the supplier may store all of the active patterns for the purchasers he's qualified to make parts for. And this is what a pattern would look like. This is a loose pattern. That's not that typical, but not completely unusual. This is a cope and a drag pattern where you might have an open board. This is really pretty unusual today. This is a pattern with a cope and drag, which in some practices works well. Sometimes people don't do this. This is the most typical for steel foundries, which is a match plate set, where you have both the drag, that's the bottom half of the mold pattern, and then a cope pattern as well. In this, the part that belongs to the purchaser is the part. This other material, like runners and risers, belongs to the foundry. And so if you look at the tooling and you get a core box to make any holes you have in the, or any special features, so you have a core box that makes cores, and then you have the patterns itself. So when we talk about moving a pattern, we're really talking about moving the entire tooling package, which includes any core boxes as well as the cope and drag patterns. The supplier, the person making the casting or the foundry making the casting, patterns are built and designed to produce the castings at the supplier's plant with his process. So the patterns will have a board or a frame that fits with the process of the supplier's pattern. And he designs it to facilitate both the highest quality and the highest efficiency to control both cost and value. And so the supplier owns all of the equipment and pattern and mold features that are not a part of the purchaser's castings, including the rigging that's added to the pattern. And the supplier owns the process and rigging design information as proprietary information. So he owns stuff as well. And you can see here with that design you saw, you've got the core here that makes the hole in the casting, and then the pattern makes this outside shape. But the risers and gating system, really, all of the stuff that's put on the pattern to make that really belongs to the foundry. And in fact, if you look at a typical sand mold, the core and this valve shape on the inside is what belongs to the purchaser, and that is his proprietary design for his component. And so he owns the tooling to make the core and the valve body itself, but the foundry has designed and adds the risers, the gating system, any chills or specialty materials, any special sands, any chaplets, in order to produce the casting itself. And so when you move the pattern, the foundry is only obligated to provide the pattern for the part itself and the tooling for the coring. They're not required, because it's their proprietary information, to provide the risers and the gating system that they use to produce the casting, or even where chills or other features are located. And so when a pattern is produced, the supplier has to develop the process and tooling combination to meet all of the requirements of the purchaser. So the foundry has to figure out where to put the risers, where to put the gate, how to orient the part, where to put specialty sand, where to put chills. And all of this is necessary in order to meet the first article qualifications. And this may take several iterations. It's not uncommon for the first attempt is not successful to meet all the quality requirements. The second attempt gets close, and then the third attempt you have a casting that's usable. And so you meet the basic requirements for the customer or the purchaser, and he allows you to begin production. But you may have ongoing issues of certain dimensions and certain quality issues that can be managed in terms of rework, but need to be part of the pattern modification. So it's not unusual to continue to modify the pattern for as much as a year after that initial pattern construction. Castings are not accepted for production until the basic requirements are met. So this is done at the risk and expense of the supplier in the typical arrangement. And because it's done at the risk of the supplier himself, then he owns that proprietary information. So in a reasonable arrangement, the non-disclosure agreement is two-sided. The supplier is not able to share information about the part with anyone, but the purchaser is not able to share information about the foundry's process with anyone. And so moving patterns to qualified suppliers that are in the same market, that are already qualified, should be straightforward, but there can be all kinds of challenges in trying to make that work. For example, changes in the molding system may require significant changes of the pattern. The foundry may want to reorient the parting line. They may want to shift where it is on the board. The board may not fit in their system, and so they may have to remount the pattern so that it fits within their molding system. And so there can be modifications required just to be able to fit it into their production system. Most foundries have differences in sand system, whether they use reclaimed sand, specialty sand in certain areas, what binder they use, what molding process and compaction they have. And so you can end up with changes in dimensions. And of course, this is a challenge today because oftentimes these historical patterns were qualified with feature-based dimensional analysis. But when you move a pattern today, you may do a 3D scan of the part and find that the surfaces that are unspecified are a variation. And oftentimes within our modern system, there's some real concerns about surfaces which don't match the solid model but are not specified. And so this dimensional issue can be really challenging when you move a pattern today. Also, the new foundry then has to figure out where to put the risers and where to put the gates. And when they do that, then they have to, again, try to figure out how to meet the non-destructive test requirements and the other quality issues that are required by the purchaser. So this first article qualification can actually end up with long delays, and if there are persistent quality issues or production issues, adjustments in the pricing. So the fact that you get a lower quote may be an artifact of the part design or the quality requirements, which once the new supplier is aware of all of these requirements, you end up with the same pricing you had with the original supplier. And then this is a real problem. Purchasers often hope, with their fingers crossed, that the new supplier will be able to make the part to the technical data package and the purchase requirements without any variations. But they may have already had the experience of two other suppliers who always needed variations in certain places, variances, because the part design itself had challenges with soundness or challenges with cracking. And so they may have to have variances, and yet they won't tell the new supplier. And so if they don't provide these historical variances and challenges to the new supplier, they really risk having long delays and changes in cost with the new supplier. These challenges are even with qualified suppliers who are in the same market that are already qualified. If you move to new suppliers, then you compound these challenges because they may quote unrealistic prices and delivery times and performance expectations. And then the purchaser has both a new expectation of what the pricing will be and yet can't purchase parts at that pricing to those quality requirements. So if we look at the risks and rewards of moving patterns, the rewards are much lower cost. If you get a much lower cost for a part, then either someone is subsidizing it, your current supplier is really taking advantage of you, or the supplier is not capable. He's just not qualified and doesn't understand all the costs. And so even if he's honest in bidding the work and you have provided all of the technical requirements, he may not be capable of making the work. He sees the existing price, he puts in a heavily loaded price because his costs are much lower, but he doesn't understand the quality expectations and requirements. And so he tries to make the part and can't physically make the part. And so after a long delay, 6 months of them trying, 3 or 4 iterations, you may have to find another alternative after a long delay. If you get a marginally lower cost from someone who really either wants the work and therefore is willing to give you a discount, or thinks that they have a clever way of having improved performance, or their basic cost of production is lower because they're in a different size range or a different market, then you can still have a long time for the first article approval, and you may end up with poorer quality or at least a challenge to get the quality that you need. Oftentimes when you move a pattern, it's because you have persistent quality problems. And so you may move it thinking that you'll get the quality that you want. But oftentimes the quality is limited by the part design and the pattern tooling. If you got a crappy pattern that's been beaten up and you don't like the surface finish and you send it to a new supplier, if the surface finish is really an artifact of how poor condition the pattern is in, then you're not going to be successful at getting improved surface quality just by moving to a different supplier. So if you don't inform the new supplier of the past waivers and part issues, then it's going to be challenged for you to actually get the performance that you hope and anticipate. You may expect a faster delivery, but foundries try to meet the expectations of their purchasers. And so if you press and you mislead or inform the most optimistic delivery, then the foundry, thinking they're competitive, thinks that if the last guy could meet that delivery, they can improve it because clearly they're smarter than the last guy. That's why you're there. And so you end up with delays from unexpected issues, and the new supplier is not fully aware of all of your supply requirements during this developmental cycle. And then you may be moving to try and get a more robust supply chain. You've only got the one foundry that can make the part. This is one part that they haven't been very successful at, so you're trying to increase your supply chain and qualify other suppliers. But the challenge is you may take it to an alternative supplier, and they fail, and you go back to the current supplier. And when you go back to the current supplier, if that part has been marginal in terms of its profitability or fit with that foundry, then they, of course, will adjust both the pricing and the quality expectations to meet their prior experience. And so there's a risk that if you try and find another supplier and you are unable to do that, you may have to go back to the original supplier, and then he will make adjustments to more accurately reflect both his internal costs and challenges in meeting your requirements. And so oftentimes you need to move the pattern. Moving the pattern is an ordinary business decision. It may be that the supplier is completely out of business or completely incapable of meeting your expectations, or doesn't want the work and so has priced it to make it unattractive to you and very attractive to him if you issue the order. And so it's an ordinary part of business to move the pattern. But when you move the pattern, it is a challenging supplier qualification, first article qualification task. It's not just moving the tooling from Foundry A to Foundry B and going right back into production in a week or 2 weeks. If you have any questions later, this is my email address and phone number. You're welcome to give me a call or drop me an email.